Henry McAllister hadn't ridden in nearly 10 years. The old saddle hung where it always had, draped over a rusted hook inside the dim barn. Dust blanketed its leather like snow, softening the creases from years of long rides and weather-beaten trails. There were spiderwebs in the stirrups, dry as paper. Time had come and settled here like an old friend, unmoving, unhurried, content to stay. He stood in the doorway, framed by the gray morning light, one hand braced against the warped wood of the barn wall. His breath steamed in the cool air, not from winter, but from the kind of spring that still remembered how to be cold. His other hand trembled slightly, fingers curling like dried leaves. A thin gold band clung to his ring finger. Worn, simple, unchanged, since the day he first slid it onto her hand. Eleanor had been gone 5 years now, and every day since Henry had walked this far, out from the porch, past the white-fenced paddock, down to the barn, but never a step more. The rhythm of grief had become a quiet pattern. Coffee, memory, regret, routine. But something was different today. Maybe it was the wind, or the sudden song of the meadowlark returning to its perch near the water pump. Maybe it was the dream that hadn't let him sleep. He dreamt of home. Not this place. Not the ranch he'd built with Eleanor in the 60s. But the first home, the one he'd grown up in as a boy, 100 miles east in a forgotten corner of Nebraska. The creaky farmhouse with the old wood-burning stove, the smell of cornfields in late summer, the creek that ran cold and clear behind the back fence, the place where his parents used to sing while hanging laundry, where he learned to ride, where he first met Eleanor, before war, before work, before death and life and everything between. In the dream, he had been walking through that field behind the house, running his hands across the tops of the tall grass like he used to do. Only he wasn't young. He was just as he was now, gray, hunched, slow. But she was there. Eleanor. Not young either, but smiling, radiant. She'd taken his hand and said only one thing. "You promised you'd take me back." He didn't remember ever saying that aloud. But in dreams, memory becomes something else. Half truth, half longing. And when he'd awoken, the ache in his chest wasn't fear or pain. It was need. A quiet urgency humming through his bones, like a tuning fork. So he'd gotten up, dressed, pulled on the old denim jacket with the torn cuff, tied the laces of his worn boots, still caked with years of dirt. And now, here he stood, staring into the barn at the saddle that hadn't felt the warmth of a rider in a decade. There was a rustle in the far stall. Henry turned slowly, blinking against the shaft of sunlight piercing the roof. The sound was familiar. Hooves shifting, the soft snort of breath, the subtle rustle of hay. From the shadows emerged a shape that filled the doorway with surprising strength. Large, slow, and regal in the way only age can make something noble. "Hey there, Samson," Henry said softly. The horse stepped forward, each movement measured, as if testing the earth for its stability. Samson's once black coat had faded to a speckled gray, like snow on coal. His mane was thinner now, his legs wrapped, in stiffness earned from years on trails and fields and muddy ditches, but his eyes were alert, wise, watchful. And they settled on Henry with a calm that made the old man's throat tighten. They had been together for 31 years. Samson had been just a spirited colt when Henry first found him at a livestock auction. Others passed him by, too stubborn, too wild, not broken. But Henry had seen something in him, a kind of fierce pride, like a challenge wrapped in muscle and fire. It had taken a year to break him in, 2 more to get him trail ready. After that, they had been inseparable. They'd driven cattle in the Badlands, ridden up snowy cliffs in Wyoming, crossed rivers deep enough to soak Henry's boots. There were nights under stars where the only warmth came from each other, mornings where frost lined Samson's muzzle, afternoons where they outran thunderheads, and always, always, Samson had been there, steady, loyal, and full of heart. Now, as Henry reached a trembling hand forward, the horse took one more step and gently pressed his broad forehead against Henry's chest. The tears came suddenly, without permission. Not loud, not heavy, just a warm, wet line down one weathered cheek. Henry let his hand fall onto Samson's neck and rested there, leaning into the quiet power that still lived in his old friend. "I think it's time, boy," Henry whispered. "Time to go home." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was the soft statement of a man who had made a decision that came not from logic, but from somewhere deeper, some place where memories and promises intertwine and become necessity. Henry began preparing that same day. He dragged the saddle into the light, dusted it with a cloth, wiped it down with oil until the leather started to breathe again. Every crack, every faded spot told a story. The stitching on the seat, redone by Eleanor's hand after a spring ride, tore the seam. The small carved initials on the underflap where their daughter once etched H+E when she was just 9. He didn't scrub that part, he left it as it was. He packed light, just one saddlebag, a map, canned goods, a photograph of Eleanor worn from decades in his wallet, a small bottle of her perfume, nearly empty, but still scented like lilac and soap and home, and a journal, blank except for the first page. To home, one last ride. He told no one. Not the neighbors who still came by every Sunday with pie and well-meaning concern, not the nurse who checked on him twice a week, not even his son, who called every other Tuesday but never stayed long on the line. Henry wasn't running away. He was going forward. One final journey to the place where everything had begun. It took him an hour to saddle Samson. The horse was patient, standing still as Henry adjusted the girth, fixed the bridle, and looped the worn reins over the horn. His joints protested with every bend. His breath came shorter. But he moved with care, with reverence, as though preparing for a ritual long forgotten. When he finally climbed into the saddle, it wasn't easy. His knees screamed, his back ached. It took him 3 tries to swing his leg over. But when he settled in, the world shifted. The ache dulled. The saddle molded to him like an old glove. And beneath him, Samson shifted, as if remembering too. The sun had just begun to dip toward the west when they turned away from the ranch, heading toward the open road that led east. He didn't look back. The journey wouldn't be fast. They were old, both of them. The trail would be slow, nights would be cold. But the road was calling. And with every step Samson took, Henry felt something inside him come alive again. A spark, a pull, a whisper from the past, gently guiding them onward. They were going home. The first full day on the trail broke slowly, wrapped in silence. The morning air was thick with dew, clinging to every blade of grass, every rust-flaked fence post that lined the dirt road east. A pale mist hovered just above the earth, softening the contours of the world around them. Henry felt it against his skin like a whisper, cold and damp, reminding him that this was no dream. He awoke before the sun cleared the low hills, lying stiff on the thin bedroll he'd unrolled beneath an old cottonwood tree the night before. He'd managed to sleep for a few hours, cradled by the familiar creak of leather and the sound of Samson shifting nearby. The aches in his joints had returned with the morning, but they were expected companions now, less like enemies, more like reminders. He sat up slowly, brushing leaves and grit from his coat. Samson stood a few feet away, grazing calmly. His breath puffed small clouds into the still air, his ears twitching at the soft chirp of birds awakening. His saddle had been removed for the night, but the bridle remained loosely tied around a broken fence slat. Henry poured a splash of water into a tin cup and drank, the metal cool against his lips. It tasted of river silt and iron. Not ideal, but water was water, and he was grateful for every drop. He watched Samson for a moment longer before speaking. "Well, boy," he muttered, "we made it through one night. Let's see if we can handle a few more." Packing up took longer than it used to. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. He folded the bedroll, cinched the bags, looped the blanket over the saddle's cantle. He checked the map he'd brought, a faded relic from the '80s with cracked plastic coating. The route he had chosen avoided highways, sticking to back roads. Old farm paths, forgotten trails, places cars no longer roamed, but memories still lingered. Willow Creek to Granger's Hollow, just under 100 miles. It didn't seem like much, not in the grand scheme of things. But when you're 87 and your horse is just shy of 30, every mile becomes its own challenge. He saddled Samson slowly, murmuring to him as he worked. The horse was calm, receptive, still strong under all that age. The girth pulled, snug with a familiar creak. Henry took a moment to run his fingers through Samson's mane, tangled and streaked with gray. "You still got it, old man," he whispered. "More than I do, that's for sure." Mounting was no easier than the day before. It required patience and leverage, using a fallen log as a step, gripping the pommel with both hands, groaning softly as he swung his leg over. But once he was up, settled into the worn seat, something remarkable happened. He felt right. There's a kind of balance between man and horse, a rhythm of movement and trust that can't be faked. Henry hadn't felt it in years, but now, swaying gently in the saddle, he felt as though some part of him that had lain dormant had awoken again. Not strong, not youthful, but true. The road unfurled before them, dusty, cracked, framed by wheat fields and the occasional rusted mailbox leaning like a drunk against its post. They passed barns with holes in the roofs, farmhouses with peeling paint, and windows boarded against time. No traffic, no sounds, but the wind and the soft clop of hooves on packed earth. Around mid-morning, they crossed paths with a man on a four-wheeler, hauling a broken fence post in the back. He slowed as he approached, narrowing his eyes at the sight of Henry atop the aged steed. Most riders were seen in parades now, not along old county roads. "Morning," the man called. Henry raised a hand. "Morning to you." "You lost, sir?" Henry smiled politely. "Nope, just heading home." The man tilted his head. "Well, don't see many of you out riding anymore. Looks good, though, both of you." "Thank you kindly." The man lingered a moment, perhaps wanting to ask more, but sensing the weight of silence between them, he nodded and drove off, the engine echoing briefly before being swallowed by distance. Henry and Samson continued on. By noon, the sun was high and warm, but not cruel. Samson moved at a steady pace, hooves rhythmically hitting the earth like a metronome. Henry's legs ached, his hips stiffened. He adjusted in the saddle, shifted weight from side to side. But he didn't complain. This was the cost of the journey, and he paid it without hesitation. They passed a dried-up creek bed, then a field of sunflowers bowing low from age and heat. Every few miles, Henry would speak, sometimes to Samson, sometimes to the open air. Little phrases, old stories, bits of songs. "You remember that summer in Dakota when we chased the storm? Lord, that wind almost knocked us both off our feet. And Eleanor, she never let me forget it." Samson flicked his ears but said nothing, though Henry fancied he understood. In the late afternoon, they reached a small grove of trees, a perfect place to rest. Henry dismounted, favoring his right leg, and led Samson to the shade. He pulled off the saddle, uncinched the girth, and rubbed down the horse with a soft cloth. They rested there for an hour. Henry napped sitting up, his back against the trunk of an elm, hat tilted over his eyes. When he woke, the light was shifting, golden again. He ate a small meal, canned beans and dry bread, and gave Samson half an apple he'd saved in a cloth wrap. As the sun began to sink, they set out again. The evenings were always hardest. The fatigue set in. The chill returned. Shadows lengthened. But they pressed on. They passed a small chapel, its windows stained and sun-faded, its bell tower leaning precariously. He remembered places like this. Places his mother would make him dress up for, comb his hair for, force him to sit still in. A pew while Reverend Carson gave sermons about fire and redemption. He smiled bitterly. Reckon I could use a little redemption. The road sloped downward, curling around a patch of dense forest. Samson slowed instinctively. Henry let him. The horse knew better than anyone where footing could be treacherous. Twilight wrapped. The world in blue and gray. The calls of crickets began, low and persistent. By the time they reached an open clearing, it was nearly full dark. Henry set up camp under the stars. No fire. He'd decided early not to risk anything that could get out of hand. His hands were not as steady as they once were, and he didn't trust himself with flames. Instead, he used the moonlight and a small battery-powered lantern to write a few words in his journal. Day 1. 33 miles. Tired, but still whole. Samson strong. I saw a hawk today, circling above the wheat. Reminded me of the old ranch before the roof caved in. Still hear Eleanor's voice when the wind's just right. He closed the book and leaned back, listening to the world breathe. The stars above were sharp and endless, scattered like salt on black velvet. The wind shifted again, cool against his skin. Samson lay nearby, head down, eyes half-lidded but alert. Henry looked up at the night and said aloud, "We're gonna make it, El. I'm bringing us home, just like I promised." No voice replied. No dream materialized. But in the silence that followed, there was a warmth, as if something unseen had settled beside him. And so he closed his eyes, slept deeply. The journey was far from over, but the first miles were behind them. The morning of the third day began with the sound of wings. A flock of birds lifted from the nearby thicket, their silhouettes dancing against the slowly lightening sky. Henry stirred awake under the elm tree, the blanket around his shoulders damp with dew. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then the ache in his hip and the steady breath of Samson nearby brought it all back. He sat up slowly, pushing his hat back on his forehead. The world was gray and gold, caught between dawn and full day. The kind of silence only broken by the call of distant crows and the gentle shift of wind through grass. He looked at Samson, still lying down but alert, ears twitching, and gave him a weary smile. "Still with me, old boy?" The horse responded with a long, slow breath, then rolled up onto his knees and stood. Henry nodded. "That makes 2 of us." He moved slowly that morning, each joint like a rusted hinge, reluctant to bend. But he took his time. No one was rushing him. He made a small breakfast, just jerky and a piece of cold cornbread from the pack, then rubbed Samson down, checked his hooves, adjusted the saddle. By the time they set out, the sun was climbing and casting long fingers of light through the trees. The road ahead was quiet, bordered by untended meadows and sagging wire fences. At one point, they passed a burned-out farmhouse. The frame still stood, blackened timbers and twisted beams, but nature had begun to reclaim it. Ivy climbed through broken windows. Grass pushed through the floorboards where the porch once stood. Henry slowed Samson to a stop. He stared at the ruins, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Funny how things fall apart so fast," he murmured. "You build 'em up with sweat and hope, and it takes one bad night to turn it to ash." He reached into his coat and pulled out an old photograph. A woman, a boy, and a young man holding a foal. The edges were curled, the ink faded, but the faces still stared back with impossible clarity. Eleanor's smile, his younger self's awkward stance. The boy, no more than 10, with eyes full of sunlight. Henry tucked the photo away and gave Samson a gentle nudge with his heel. Come on. Nothing for us in ghosts. The day grew warmer, the road narrower. They followed a stretch of forgotten county route that twisted alongside a river. The water was slow-moving, shallow, reflecting the sky like a broken mirror. Willows bent low along the banks, their branches trailing like fingers in the current. It was here, just before noon, that they encountered the bridge. It stood like a sentinel, an old wooden structure barely wide enough for a cart, let alone a car. The boards were bleached gray, spotted with moss and age. Some slats were missing entirely, and others hung precariously. Like broken teeth, Henry pulled Samson to a stop, staring at it. Well, he said quietly, this is going to be tricky. The river beneath wasn't deep, but the embankment was steep and lined with slippery rocks. Crossing by water would be dangerous, especially for Samson. But the bridge, that was no guarantee either. He dismounted slowly, his boots landing, with a crunch on the gravel path. Leading Samson by the reins, he approached the edge of the bridge and stepped carefully onto the first plank. It groaned under his weight, but held. He tested each step, moving slowly, eyes scanning ahead. When he reached the midpoint, he turned and beckoned to Samson. Come on, boy. One at a time. Easy. Samson hesitated. His hooves pawed at the ground. He lowered his head and sniffed the air, then looked at Henry. You trust me? Henry asked, voice soft. The horse seemed to consider it. Then, one hoof forward, then another. Step by step, the old horse moved onto the bridge, ears forward, tail still. Henry guided him gently, whispering encouragement, watching the boards beneath tremble with each step. Halfway across, a sharp crack echoed beneath them. A board splintered near Samson's hind leg and gave way. The horse startled, head snapping up, muscles tense. Henry raised both hands. Easy! Easy now! Samson froze, balanced with one hoof hanging just above the gap. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a quiet snort and a flick of his ear, Samson adjusted his weight and stepped forward again, bypassing the gap. Attaboy, Henry whispered. That's it. Moments later, they stepped off the bridge onto solid ground again. Henry exhaled slowly, rubbing Samson's muzzle. You've still got it in you, old man. Braver than most. He let them rest under the willow trees, the sound of the river behind them. He took off his boots and soaked his sore feet in the cold water, grimacing with relief. Samson drank from the edge, then wandered to graze among the tall reeds. As the sun reached its peak, Henry pulled out his journal again, crossed the river. Bridge's bones were brittle, but we made it. Samson almost fell, but didn't. Maybe he knows how much this means to me. Or maybe he just wants to see the end too. He paused before adding a line in smaller, messier handwriting. Saw a heron. Reminded me of the one Elle used to paint. She always said they were guardians. The afternoon. Ride was quieter. The landscape flattened into long stretches of prairie. Golden, swaying, endless. Insects hummed. A hawk circled above. Time passed without conversation, but Henry didn't mind. The silence between him and Samson was a living thing, full of understanding. As evening fell, the air cooled. They reached a small town, a shadow of its former self. Fewer than a dozen buildings still stood. The gas station was boarded up, the diner's sign hung by a single bolt, creaking in the wind. But there was a church, and next to it a tiny general store with a light still on. Henry dismounted and led Samson to the store's hitching post. Inside, a bell jingled as he entered. A young woman stood behind the counter, startled by the sight of an elderly man in dust-covered boots and a duster coat. But she smiled warmly. "Evening, sir. Evening. Didn't expect anyone open around here. Family runs this place. We never really shut it down even when the rest of the town left. Henry bought a few essentials, canned beans, matches, water, and a handful of peppermints, which he slid into his pocket with a smile. For the horse, he explained. She glanced outside, saw Samson standing patiently by the post. That him? Henry nodded. His name's Samson. Been with me through more than most, the woman tilted her head. You traveling far? Just back home. She didn't press for more, and he appreciated that. As he left, she called out, Safe journey to you both. Henry raised a hand, in parting. Thank you. One step at a time. That night, they camped just outside the town, near the ruins of an old playground. A single swing still hung from its chain, swaying gently in the breeze. Henry stared at it for a long time, remembering the laughter of children, his children, decades ago. He fed Samson, gave him the peppermints one by one. The horse crunched them slowly, then nuzzled Henry's chest. We're getting there, Henry murmured. Not far now, just a few more days. He lay down beneath the stars again, the ground cold against his back. Sleep came slower this time, too many memories rising like ghosts in the dark. But Samson stood nearby, silent and watchful. When Henry finally drifted off, he dreamed of Eleanor, not young, not old, just her. Waiting on the porch of the old house, a mug of tea in her hand, the wind in her hair. He whispered in his sleep, I'm coming, Elle. Just hold on. The morning broke quiet, heavy with the hush that comes just before a summer storm. Henry could feel it in his bones. He'd known weather long enough to read its signs better than any forecast. The weight in the air, the sudden stillness, the way the birds went silent. He sat on a low stump near the dying playground, sipping coffee from his tin mug. The clouds overhead were flat and gray, with darker bellies lurking just beyond the horizon. He glanced at Samson, who was chewing, lazily on a patch of grass nearby, his tail swatting at invisible flies. We're gonna have to beat the rain today, Henry muttered, rubbing his stiff knee. No use dragging our tails. Packing up was slower than usual. His fingers fumbled with the saddle straps, and his shoulder twinged when he lifted the gear. Samson stood patiently, his big eyes following Henry's every movement, like he knew the old man was running on fumes. By mid-morning, they were on the road again, heading east. The path now ran through a series of long-forgotten back roads, places that didn't appear on maps anymore. Old county trails cracked and swallowed by weeds, mailboxes with names long since faded. The journey was less about miles, and more about moments, small fragments of a life once lived. At a crossroads, Henry paused. There was a rusted sign bent nearly in half. Most of the letters were missing, but enough remained for him to recognize it. Beach Hollow, he whispered. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map he'd sketched weeks before. There was no GPS on this journey. No cell towers, no help if something went wrong, just memory and ink. This way, old boy, he said, nudging Samson down the smaller fork in the road. It was narrower here, shaded by ancient oaks and wild magnolias. The road turned from pavement to gravel and eventually to packed dirt. As they walked, Henry spoke. Not to fill the silence, but because the memories were too thick not to share. This used to be where your grandpa took me fishing. There was a creek not far from here, full of catfish and crawdads. I fell in once, head first. Elle laughed so hard she almost dropped her sketchbook. Samson flicked an ear, listening. We used to take that Model T down this road every Sunday. Me and Elle, before the kids. She'd pack a pie, and we'd sit by the water till the sun went down. You'd think a man'd forget those kind of things, but I remember it clearer than yesterday. They stopped for lunch beneath a mossy sycamore. Henry shared his jerky with Samson, and in return, the horse leaned his head onto Henry's shoulder and let out a warm sigh. It was something he used to do when they were both younger, during cattle drives or long nights by the fire. It meant comfort, safety. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Henry whispered. As the day wore on, the wind picked up. Dust danced across the road. Overhead, the sky grew darker. Blue turned to steel, clouds swelling like bruises. By late afternoon, the storm broke. It came without much warning, just a crack of thunder that split the silence, and then the skies opened. Rain poured down in thick sheets, turning the dirt path into a slippery mess. Henry pulled his coat tighter and guided Samson toward the nearest grove of trees, searching for shelter. They found it in the form of an old barn. It stood alone in a clearing, its roof sagging, doors half open. But it was dry inside, or dry enough. They ducked into the darkness just as lightning lit up the sky behind them. Inside it smelled of rot and straw and long-gone horses. But it had 4 walls, and that was enough. Henry stripped off his wet coat and rubbed Samson down with a blanket from his pack. The horse stood calm, seemingly unfazed by the thunder rumbling above. "Remember that flood in '78?" Henry asked, sitting on an overturned feed bucket. "You were just 5 then. We were hauling hay up near Mill Ridge, and the water came up fast. You carried me out like your tail was on fire." He smiled to himself, remembering the way they'd both come, out-soaked, steaming in the cold air. "You saved me more times than I can count. Probably more than I deserve." The rain lasted hours. Henry dozed against a wooden beam, the sound of the downpour like a lullaby. When he woke, it was evening, and the storm had passed. The air was cooler, cleaner. The sun was a faint orange smear on the edge of the world. They moved out slowly, leaving the barn behind. The road ahead was soaked, muddy, but Samson walked without complaint, his hooves steady, his gait sure. Henry, for all his age and fatigue, found strength in the quiet resolve of the animal beside him. Just before sunset, they came upon a hill. Henry pulled Samson to a stop at the base and looked up. His breath caught in his throat. At the top stood a lone tree, an ancient oak, massive and proud. It was the same tree from his childhood, the one where he'd carved his initials with L's inside a heart, the one they used to lie under in the summer heat, whispering about futures they hadn't even dreamed yet. "We made it to Cobbler's Rise," he murmured. He led Samson up the hill slowly, the mud squishing under their boots and hooves. When they reached the top, Henry stood in silence, staring at the initials still faintly visible in the bark, H+E. He ran his fingers over the carving, now worn by time and weather. "She said this tree would outlast us both." Samson lowered his head, grazing nearby. Henry took off his hat and held it over his chest. She was right. They camped under the oak tree that night. The stars were visible again, bright and clean in the post-storm sky. Henry lay on his back, staring up through the branches. "I can feel her getting closer," he whispered. "The house is just 2 more valleys over. That's all. 2 valleys." He paused. "Do you think she'll remember me, Sam? Do you think, after all this time, the place will still feel like home?" The horse made a low sound, almost like a hum, then lay down beside him. Henry reached over and rested his hand on Samson's side. "You've brought me this far. We've crossed rivers and storms and every pain these old bones could throw at us. I just need one more day. Just one." That night, Henry dreamed of a porch swing and children's laughter, of pie cooling on a windowsill, of a dog barking somewhere in the yard, and Elle's voice calling his name like it never left. Morning came quietly. No trumpets of birdsong, no rustle of early breezes. Just the pale light of dawn creeping across the fields, turning the world silver and still. Henry stirred beneath his blanket, stiff but at peace. For the first time in days, there was no ache in his joints that he hadn't already made peace with. He sat up slowly, blinking at the horizon where the hills gave way to a low valley. Beyond that lay his childhood home, Elle's home, their home. It had been 73 years since he last walked that road as a boy of 15, waving goodbye to his parents as he chased dreams far bigger than the dusty porch he left behind. Now, at 88, he was returning not to reclaim his youth, but to honor it. He rose and stretched, his limbs popping like old floorboards. Samson was already awake, standing nearby, chewing thoughtfully on dry grass. His mane was graying. His legs slow, but his eyes still held that steady fire. Henry patted the stallion's thick neck. "You ready, partner? Just one more hill." Samson gave a soft snort and nudged Henry's shoulder gently. The descent into the valley was slower than expected. Recent rains had turned the trail to clay in places, and twice Henry had to stop to help Samson find stable footing. But the old horse moved with purpose, sure and slow, like he understood what this meant to his rider. They passed long-forgotten fences, leaning like drunks in a bar. Trees lined the fields, sycamores, pecans, and cottonwoods, casting long shadows across the earth. The air smelled of memory, dew, bark, and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle that still grew wild in the hedges. Henry saw the house just after noon. It appeared like a ghost from the tall grass, rising out of the past. White-painted wood, chipped and flaked from years of neglect, but still standing proud. The porch sagged at the corner, and one shutter hung askew, but the shape of it, the bones, were exactly as he remembered, his breath caught in his throat. "There she is, Sam," he said hoarsely. "Home?" Samson paused, sensing the emotion. He blinked slowly, then began the final 100 yards with quiet dignity, each step deliberate. Henry's feet touched the soil of the old yard, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. He saw Elle, on the porch steps, barefoot, waving a blue ribbon she'd won for her peach pie at the county fair. He saw himself running after their little boy, Thomas, in the yard, the boy shrieking with laughter. He heard the old screen door creak open and slam shut, the way it always did when someone left in a hurry. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch. It groaned beneath his weight, but held. He stood before the door, chipped, sun-bleached, familiar. He reached for the knob and turned it. Unlocked, of course. No one ever locked doors out here, not back then. The air inside was stale, dry, and thick with dust, but the moment he stepped over the threshold, Henry felt her. Elle not in a haunting way, but in a warm embrace of memory. Her laughter echoed in the boards, her footsteps in the hall, her voice calling from the kitchen. He walked through the living room, fingers tracing the outline of the old piano, now missing keys and bowed with age. The same piano Elle used to play on warm nights. "You are my sunshine," always off-key but more beautiful than anything he'd ever heard. Henry sat down in the old armchair by the window. It was moth-eaten, half-collapsed, but it felt right. Samson stood just outside the window, watching. Henry smiled. "You made it, old boy. You really did." He reached into his bag and pulled out the small wooden box he'd carried the entire way. Inside were Elle's ashes, preserved, protected, held close. He set the box on the table beside him and closed his eyes. I kept my promise. Outside, the light softened as the afternoon gave way to golden evening. Henry walked the property slowly. He visited the barn where he'd once hidden Christmas gifts, the treehouse long fallen in the backwoods, The small pet cemetery behind the garden where a dozen cats, 3 dogs, and 1 ornery rooster named Chuck were buried. Each step was a step into a past he'd feared he'd forgotten, but hadn't. At dusk, he sat beneath the willow tree by the creek, the same tree where he'd proposed to Elle. He opened the wooden box and let a handful of her ashes scatter into the breeze. They danced in the fading light, mingling with dust motes and fireflies. "Welcome home, sweetheart." Samson walked over and stood beside him. Henry leaned his head against the horse's flank. They stayed there until night fell. Henry didn't leave the next day. He didn't need to. There was nothing left to chase, no final destination, no dream to reclaim. Just peace. Just stillness. He cleaned the porch as best he could, brushed dust from the picture frames still hanging on the walls, lit a candle on the kitchen table and let it burn through the night. And every evening he and Samson would walk to the willow and sit together. No words, just the rustle of leaves and the comfort of old souls who had traveled far and arrived exactly where they needed to be. Weeks passed like whispers. Then one morning, Henry didn't wake up. He was found. In his chair by the window, hat in his lap, eyes closed, a soft smile on his lips. The box was empty beside him, its contents returned to the earth. Samson stood vigil outside for days. Neighbors who still remembered Henry came and paid respects. They buried him beside Elle, beneath the willow. Samson stayed by the grave. No rope held him. No fence confined him. He simply remained, an old soldier keeping watch over his fallen comrade. When the winter came, they found him lying peacefully beneath the tree, his body still and eyes closed. 2 journeys, 2 souls, 1 road. Epilogue. Year later, a young couple bought the house. They cleaned it up, repainted the porch, fixed the barn. In the tall grass behind the willow, they placed a small brass plaque. "Here rest Henry and Samson, partners in life, wanderers of the long road home. Visitors still come. Sometimes an elderly man with a cane, remembering cattle drives from a half-century ago. Sometimes a child hearing tales of a man and his horse who walked across the state for love. Sometimes just the wind rustling through the trees, whispering secrets only the road remembers. And far beyond the fields, where the sky stretches wide and wild, an old man rides again, strong and tall in the saddle, his horse galloping beside him. No pain, no time, just home."